What's up, U.S. history students? Back again. Want to spend a little bit of time, and I'm also going to give you another link, either on Schoology or maybe even in the comment section of this YouTube video, about the most important thing that really happens in terms of the Cold War, other than the Berlin Wall going up during JFK's administration in the early 60s. And again, I'm still in that same PowerPoint, Kennedy and the Cold War. I'm going to blow my screen up here. And that all-important thing is going to happen in 1962, and it's called the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, if I can get my face off the map a minute. Okay. Here's the thing. We talked about with the Bay of Pigs from an earlier lesson, the failed invasion attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro using Cuban exiles. The Cubans have started to become friendly with the Russians and cozier with the Russians and their leader, Khrushchev. And so the Russians are going to send missiles with nuclear capabilities into Cuba. Now, if you look at the map with me, you'll notice why this is such a huge threat for the U.S. and why the U.S. government, and John F. Kennedy included, comes out and says he will not let those missiles stay there. Now, how we get rid of them is really what becomes known as the Cuban Missile Crisis in these really intense 13 days. A really good movie, if you have time, which right now you might, is the movie called 13 Days that walks through this tense situation. And you'll see these rings on this map, and this is a historical map that was used to explain some of this to the American people in the 60s. The missiles they have initially can hit that second ring, right, which you can see right on the outside of that ring is Washington, D.C., and ultimately they get missiles in there that could deliver a nuclear warhead to every major city in continental U.S. outside of Seattle. And that's that outside ring. And so the U.S. has to decide, what are we going to do? JFK, a lot of his advisors initially, especially the military guys, the chiefs of staff, they want an airstrike and they want to invade Cuba, take out the missiles, and take care of Castro finally. However, JFK is a little hesitant to just go in instantly without trying some other options. He knows potentially they may not get all the sites if they go in there and hit an airstrike, and then some of those missiles could be launched. This could be taking us down the path to World War III already in the early 1960s with the Russians, and now we have two countries with nuclear capabilities, and he really wants to avoid that at all costs. And so another really key point here, Cuba's really not the issue for us, right? The proximity is. We're really, and you can see it on the bottom point there, Kennedy makes it very clear to the Russians and the rest of the world, if those missiles get fired on the American continent, we will see that as an attack from the Russians, not just some attack from small Cuba off our coast, but that is a direct attack from the USSR. Okay, and so again, Cuba's kind of the middleman. Again, this is us versus Russia. Once again, which this whole era, right? We said Cold War, communism, containment really is. And so ultimately, after days of deliberation, the U.S. and JFK are going to decide to do a quarantine. Kind of interesting to use that word. Now a blockade, right? Nothing into Cuba, nothing out. We're going to let any more missiles come in. It still means we're going to have a confrontation at sea. It still means those missiles that are already there are currently there and not going anywhere for the moment. But it gives the Russians a chance to kind of pull back without looking too weak. And ultimately, the U.S., JFK, Russia, and Khrushchev reach an agreement. The missiles will be dismantled. The U.S. pledges to never invade Cuba again like we did during the Bay of Pigs. And we will also get rid of some missiles that we had in Turkey and get rid of those so those don't appear as a threat to the Russians. And so ultimately, the quarantine, the blockade works. The missiles are dismantled under UN inspections, and they're created and brought back to the Soviet Union. Now, another really important character, if you watch that movie, 13 Days, with JFK is his brother, Bobby Kennedy, who was the Attorney General, who we'll talk more about later. He ends up running for the Democratic nomination for President of the United States in 1968, and then he gets assassinated. But that's a little foreshadowing. Ultimately, out of this, there's a hotline put in between the U.S. and the Russians. So the White House and Kremlin, kind of their version of the White House, can speak to each other before tensions escalate. And they start doing some limiting of nuclear testing.